Ann Powers is one of the leading voices in popular music criticism working today. Since 2011, she has been NPR Music's critic and correspondent. She writes for NPR's music news blog, The Record, and she can be heard on NPR's news magazines and music programs, including right here on our own WMOT-FM 89.5. Before coming to NPR, Ann Powers was chief pop music critic at the Los Angeles Times, senior critic at Blender, senior curator at the Experience Music Project, now the Museum of Pop Culture in Seattle. She also worked as a pop critic for the New York Times and as a senior editor at the Village Voice. In addition to her journalistic writing, Powers' previous books include Weird Like Us, My Bohemian America, Tori Amos, Piece by Piece, co-written with Tori Amos, and Rock She Wrote, Women Write About Rock, Rap, and Pop, co-edited with Evelyn McDonald. In case you're wondering what kind of academic foundation can help prepare someone for a career like this, Powers earned a Bachelor of Arts degree in creative writing from San Francisco State University and a Master of Arts degree in English from the University of California. Today, she's here to talk to us about her newest and, in some ways, finest book, Good Booty, Love and Sex, Black and White, Body and Soul in American Music, published in late 2017 by Day Street Books, an imprint of HarperCollins. And with no further ado, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Ann Powers.
Thank you so much for coming. It's so great to see you all, and what a nice packed room. Nice to see some friendly faces in the crowd, and all of you are now my new friends. So welcome. So what is this book, Good Booty? It is a retelling of the history of American popular music. It is an intervention into the history of popular music in this country. It is about, as it says, love and sex, but what do I mean by eroticism, which is a driving term in this book? I think before we start talking about exactly what the book does, and the way I'm organizing this talk is we're all friends, and I'm going to be informal. I'm going to play you a little music representing the journey that this book takes. And I'm going to talk about the story it tells using examples from each chapter. But as far as what the overarching idea, or the reason that I wrote this book, back to that word eroticism. I've been a music critic, as Greg said, for more than 20 years, and I have, from the beginning of my career, been intrigued by a fundamental question, which is, how does music make us feel? How does music make us feel in every sense of that term? Sensually, physically, in our bodies, emotionally, in our hearts, in the way we relate to each other, and ideologically in the attitudes that we form about each other, about each other's identities, about ourselves, our power, our sense of freedom and liberation. These are the questions that even when I was just a kid, just a teenager, I started to ask about music. Why does music make me feel a certain way? Why is it when, well, why don't I just read a couple pages here from the preface. I think I was around 9 years old when I realized that music is sexy. From the first time I heard the songs that moved me to distraction in childhood by the Beatles and the Jackson 5, I loved them because they affected my whole body, making me think hard and respond deeply and jump like a jelly bean. Music gave me a way to engage with those funny feelings that my friend Lisa said rose up in her when she looked at a picture of Keith Richards slouching around in the Rolling Stones. Feelings my mother wouldn't mention, and the boys in the schoolyard snickered about, but wouldn't own. The girls in my life were the ones who wanted to name those feelings, and we did it by dancing to the beat of the Bee Gees and Queen and Blondie, and once we all hit college, Prince, and I did wear my Prince necklace in honor of the greatest musician who ever lived. We became sexual by playing records, sweating in the crowd at rock shows, making out with boys in bands or other fans or each other, while music played loud in cars and basements and through the walls of the bathrooms at the Oddfellows Hall. When I started writing about music for a living, I felt driven not to merely acknowledge its erotic pull, but to really understand it, This took time, a lot of listening, more sweating in clubs, more dancing. I eventually realized that in order to grasp how the sounds I loved related to the sex I was having, that everyone was having, I'd need to learn more about how music factored into the history of the places where it originated. Rock and jazz and soul and hip-hop are American inventions, born of and nurtured by people mixing and mingling, claiming themselves and reaching for others. I knew that. I could see the connections forming all around me in the music world. Digging into record crates and spending time with my nose buried in books helped me understand the context for those developments. My own movement back and forth from the archive to the audience has continually shaped my understanding. I've learned more than I can easily express from the examples of women, of queer folk, and of people of color who refuse to remain on the margins, both as musicians and as writers, filling in the gaps in the standard histories of the American experience. I gained my rebel attitude from punk, my joy from disco, my openness from singer-songwriters, my seriousness from soul. I went to thousands of shows. What I remember most from them is the physicality of it all. The heat of the Metallica mosh pit, and the tenderness of tears shared at a Tori Amos sing-along. The way someone I'd never met before grabbed my hand when Kirk Franklin led his gospel choir toward an anointing. The growing literature of popular music scholarship and criticism, furthered by places like where we are right now, helped me understand the lost histories and the inner drives that lie behind these experiences. I came to understand that American popular music, our nation's first original art form, is made of our best impulses toward freedom, community, and self-realization, and our worst legacies of racial oppression and sexual hypocrisy. I decided I wanted to write a book about American music and American sex, but one that would really be about American dreaming, American violence, pleasure, hunger, lies, and love. So that was the personal motivation behind writing this book. Before I started reading, I mentioned the term erotic. The ideological foundation is grounded in an essay that the great feminist writer, womanist writer, Audre Lorde wrote, called The Uses of the Erotic. And what Audre Lorde said in that essay is that eroticism is discussed in our society as related to sex, but in fact, it is about that kernel within ourselves that reaches for pleasure, that reaches for joy and connection with others, and that can never be extinguished, no matter how dehumanized we become, how much we are oppressed, how much we are marginalized or silenced. Our erotic drive is our drive to be fully human and fully in communion with each other. And it's my contention that it is popular music that best expresses this sense of the erotic of all of our American art forms. Now, also essential to this idea is the matter of how Americans have related to each other and how our society has been structured from its beginnings as a colonialist pre-nation and then a nation, founded tragically on the legacy of slavery. American music is African American music. American music is the music of people of color, of Native Americans, of Latin people, Latino, Latinx, people coming to this country. It is the music of all of these sources coming together, Europeans as well. But foundationally, I believe, African American music is the heart and soul of American music, and that's why my book starts in New Orleans. New Orleans, any Louisianans in the house? Anybody go to New Orleans on a regular basis, or at least sometimes, or have you been there? To me, New Orleans is the capital of this country. It is the cultural capital of this country, and the reason for that is because of how the city was born. It was born as the baby of diaspora. Who knows what diaspora means? Anybody want to tell me? You're nodding your head.
I don't want to tell you that.
Diaspora is the journey. It is the journey of people from their homeland to a new homeland and the transmission of culture through that journey. It is most often associated, when we talk about it, with the African diaspora that was rooted in the enslavement of Africans. So the African diaspora, as it came to the U.S. and founded American music, came through the Caribbean and connected with Spanish colonialists, with native Caribbean peoples, to form a rhythmic foundation to this music. My first chapter talks about that foundation. When you look at popular histories, always think about that, popular histories of American music. Are they playing on stereotypes? Are they telling the real story, or are they telling the story that comes from preconceptions we have about each other and observing each other? And how does, even up to the present day, popular music sometimes free us from stereotypes and sometimes reinforce those stereotypes? So, also in the 19th century, jazz was born in New Orleans. But I think it's really important to think beyond those simple ideas of where our music started. There's a great theorist whose name is Joseph Roach, and he came up with this idea of the behavioral vortex, and I write about this. The behavioral vortex is an imagined space that correlates to a real space. In New Orleans, it was Storyville. Storyville, does anybody know what Storyville was? What was Storyville?
Red light district.
It was a red light district. It was a place where prostitutes, sex workers were confined in New Orleans. Now, the history and the mythology of jazz is that it sprang out of Storyville, out of people playing piano in those houses of ill repute, as they were called then. In fact, music was everywhere in New Orleans, but it became associated with this one region. Now, what Joseph Roach would say is that we can only kind of get in our brains, we can't sort of grasp the idea that music was everywhere. So we want to put it somewhere particularly. So we put it in the red light district in our minds and in the way we tell history. And the rest of it is forgotten. The fact of people dancing in the street, the fact of enslaved people gathering on plantations on Sunday and dancing as a form of worship. The fact of those ballrooms where Creole women came and danced, and many of them of mixed race dancing with white men, and the whole story of that complicated story, which I also talk about in that chapter. But anyway, so Storyville was the place where jazz was born, but all of New Orleans is the place where, in my mind, American popular music was born. That's the first chapter. Then I move up to New York City. The reason I go to New York City at the dawn of the jazz age, at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, is because New York is the other capital of American culture. It is the capital of immigrant American culture, of this idea, another ruling idea of the foundation of this country, which is that we are all descended of immigrants, of people coming from all over the world. And New York was also a place where people migrated from within the city, including many women, within this country, including many women. At the turn of the 20th century, there was a fascinating phenomenon that happened. It has sometimes been termed as women adrift. Women began to move away from their homes in other cities around the country and in rural homes and come to the city, often come to New York. And they, sort of similar to the way that white observers cast African enslaved people as a threat, these women were thought of as a threat. But it was the beginning of a new sense of liberation among women. This is before the vote, before suffrage, this is before feminism had been articulated fully. And in popular music, this was captured in certain dances and the music of the time. So you have these two things happening. Women are on the move, immigrants are on the move. And at the Chicago World's Fair, this is jumping a little away from New York, right around that time, right before the beginning of the 20th century, there was an entrepreneur named Saul Bloom, and he did an interesting thing. He brought over, he had been in Paris to another World's Fair, trying to think, like, what could we do at this World's Fair that would be cool and exotic and capture this feeling of people coming from all over, and, you know, American culture coming from other places. And he opened a pavilion that was dedicated to the idea of the Middle East and North Africa, and their dances and music and culture. And there, women danced the belly dance. Now, what's interesting about the belly dance is that it is a Middle Eastern dance, that's real, but it also is very similar to those same dances that Africans were doing, Africans who became African Americans were doing. It involved shaking your hips in a certain way, very similar to the dances that African Americans did in the religious dance known as the ring shout, for example. It was about shaking your hips, it was about moving your body in certain ways. And so it became a safe way for white Americans to kind of think about the African American legacy by kind of deflecting it through the Middle East. It was an act of détournement, I guess the theorists would call it. Those dances, the belly dance, which became a sensation in the last decade of the 19th century, and the music that went with it, which often sounded like jazz, with little Middle Eastern inflections. And you might have all learned that song as a child in the south of France, where the women like to dance, you know? Saul Bloom wrote that song, and that was one of the theme songs of the belly dance. Well, that turned into a whole bunch of other dances, or it fed a craze of a whole bunch of other dances. The black bottom, the shimmy, the Charleston, they had many names, Ballin', the Jack. And people started to think about sexuality and eroticism, as we talked about, connecting with others and feeling pleasure in your own body through these dances and the songs that were written about them. So here's the interesting thing about this music and these dances that were very popular in the teens and 20s leading into the Jazz Age. As I said, they expressed this new sense of liberation among women. And if any of you have studied that era and read like The Great Gatsby or other classics of the Jazz Age, or a book like Nella Larson, Passing, those books also talk about the same sense of what do women do with this idea that they might be people too and they could also be free. At the same time, marriage was changing. And there was a phenomenon or a popular sort of self-help trend that became known as sexology. And that was the science of sex as expressed by people like Havelock Ellis. And that was all about having a marriage where you weren't just in it to have kids, and women were just in it to like secure their place in society, but you actually married someone because you liked them. What a new idea. And at that time, this was a kind of a new idea. And so songs like this one I'm going to play for you now, I Wish I Could Shimmy Like My Sister Kate, and dances like the Black Bottom and the Shimmy, and dances like the tango, which was a partner dance, were symbolic ways that people expressed the same desire to relate to each other more equally within marriage, within their relationship.